So this comes into a bigger set of projects I've been working on for a number of years related to hockey enforcers. I got into this through my teaching and using hockey enforcer memoirs in the violence and sports section in my sociology sport class. I was struck initially by the similarities between a book Dave Schultz wrote in 1987 and Georges Larocque's memoir, which was mid-2000, first decade of the 2000s. And just the similarities of the things they were saying in terms of the careers and other things. That spun me off into looking at all the enforcer memoirs I could get my hands on and various films and other sorts of things. Last hockey conference, I presented on a couple of pieces of literature that dealt with hockey enforcers as fictional characters. So it's an ongoing sort of thing. If I'm doing hockey, it's tied to enforcers. This is looking at Probert's own memoir. Was called Tough Guy, My Life on the Edge, and a 9 years later film called, same thing, Tough Guy, but the Bob Probert story. And I'm just fascinated by the difference in approaches to these things. Even though it's the same story, even uses many of the same quotes from Probert himself within it, they have a very different approach. So that's what I'm exploring here. Okay. So, Tough Guy, My Life on the Edge. It's amongst a pile of memoirs that came out in a very similar time frame. There had been a couple of earlier ones from Tiger Williams, Dave Schultz, and a couple of early enforcers from the 70s. But then a really big gap, and not a lot until this rush of ones came out right at the tail end of the first decade of the 2000s, and 8 or 10 in the last, in the years ensuing that, with Larocque's probably being the most well-known one. But this one was one of the earlier ones. It follows the typical chronological narrative that you see in an athlete memoir. You get the rise of the athlete. It follows them through their youth into their early career, and then essentially the fall of the athlete, which in Probert's case, it really becomes a rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall, because of all of the issues he had with drug abuse, with run-ins with police and other sorts of things. It's very much a repeat cycle of this. The book is interesting in that it came out right after his death. Unfortunately died quite young at the age of 45 from a massive cardiac event while he was out boating with his family, shortly after his retirement. And he had done interviews with Kirsten McClelland-Day, a Canadian sports writer who's done a lot of these memoirs and things with athletes. And this was done, he died in July and the book came out in October. So you got a little bit of retrospective from the head. Steve Eiserman wrote a chapter, and his wife, Danny Probert. The epilogues and the openings of these things. This book was compared academically, and Chandel, who's in Norway, looked at this particular book and the Boy on Ice book about Derek Bogard collectively, because they do have similar aspects of it, with both being enforcers, both dying young, and both having ongoing drug issues. She chalked it out, but her major themes that she came up with for both of those were hypermasculinity, in terms of the way that you live in the world and interact with teammates and opponents, certain acceptance of violence, both of it and violence to yourself, the willingness to suffer injury and to the violence to themselves. She also included the drug use amongst that, because in the case of Bogard, it was very much dealing with the psychological and physical of his job he was doing, and particularly later in life for Probert, his drug use was tied to becoming pain and injury from his career. I would say I've looked at, like I said, I've looked at all these enforcer memoirs that are out in the market now. My contextualizing, I would say, looked at fun and camaraderie and hazing. That certainly actually fits into the hypermasculinity part that Chandel talks about, that a lot of the things that Probert really liked about hockey would very much be tied to that idea of guys hanging out and being guys together. He does talk about hazing and pranking other players quite a bit. And Chondo looked at that and says, you know, that's making sure that, you know, the barriers of masculinity aren't crossed. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. He does talk about the code. He talks about enforcers' jobs a bit, but not as much as some of the other ones. Some of the other memoirs that came out after him were much more analytical about that, much more the idea that they're trying to explain themselves to the world. He just did what he did and got on with it in a lot of ways. You know, recognition that being a tough guy, being a guy who would stand up for his teammates would be his way to the NHL. But, you know, it wasn't the full focus of it like some other pieces of literature and things that are out there. It was certainly not shy in talking about his drug use. And he did openly talk about that a fair bit. It's almost unavoidable, to be fair, because it was so well known in the media and he had so many run-ins with the police because of drunk driving charges and crashing his car and crashing his motorcycle and other sorts of things that you almost couldn't have done that, right? So that's essentially kind of a quick look at the book. The film does some more interesting things with the story, I think. It's written, directed, and produced by Geordie Day. What he did was that he actually used Kirsten McClellan's Day's interview tapes as part of what he structured the story around. If you're not familiar with the way these athlete memoirs are written, typically the co-writer, ghostwriter, whatever you want to call them, sits down with the athlete over a series of interviews. They record the interviews, the athlete tells their story, and the writer assembles it into a narrative format that's, you know, readable and sellable. So McClellan Day had these interview tapes. So throughout the film, Probert is talking about things himself, even though he's passed some a number of years before that, 9 years before. He's still actually talking in his own way around these sorts of things. It's very grainy sort of sounding stuff from her cassette recorder, but that still brings his voice into the story. As is common with all kinds of with these sorts of documentaries, all kinds of other voices are in there. You get family, old teammates, executives, beat reporters, and broadcasters that are in there talking about him. This particularly privileges two executives that were dealing with him in Detroit, Colin Campbell and Jim Lights. Sheldon Kennedy gets a lot of airtime. He was an old teammate of Probert, but also his, we'll say, compadre in motorcycling and drug use, a fair bit. It does do a little bit of glorification of fighting with some of the old clips, and certainly with Probert's discussion himself on the top of this. The film starts out with the two big fights that he had with Ty Domi in 1992 at Madison Square Garden, where Domi was almost doing a professional wrestler's gimmick here with the idea that Probert's the heavyweight champion and Domi wants a shot at the title. That's the way he talked up. And they actually talked to Domi in the film around that. But that's really about it. It doesn't go into glorifying. It doesn't do as much of the explaining the enforcer's role as a lot of the memoirs do, and certainly not the films, The Last of the Gladiators and Ice Guardians. It is less focused on the hockey. Although when they do talk about the hockey and the fighting, the other enforcers they bring in, Stu Grimson and Joey Corser, who was a teammate and later got in fights with him, they talk about his intensity, his complete and utter disregard for himself, which would later, of course, lead to injuries and other sorts of things, and just the way that he would go right at it. Right. The thing with this film is it's a much sadder, much darker thing than the memoir. It's a lot of people talking about his career and his drug use and other sorts of things, and expressing essentially their regrets that they couldn't help him more, and you know, highlighting how his problems dominated his life. You know, it gives a lot of time to Danny Probert, who was heavily involved in the production of the film, where she talks about his frequent rehabs. She talks about his dealings with his family. She talks about how there were times he just disappeared out of their lives for days at a time when he went on a particular bender. The drug use and the way that was implicated in his life was really the primary focus of this film. It came across quite strongly throughout. The film does get at CTE issues, although quite late to the end of the film. It deals with it in a way that other documentaries have not, in being very open about it, trying to put it on the table as a topic that really needs to be discussed. The other documentaries, Ice Guardians, Last of the Gladiators, I mean, you get discussion of drug use and the ongoing dealing with injuries, but the CTE thing never really comes up. It's probably because this film's a little bit later. Of all the films that are out there on enforcers, there's not that many, but there's a handful. I would say Goon, The Last of the Enforcers, the sequel to the fictional comedy, is the only other one that really kind of deals with that. And that really just kind of takes a sad, tragic approach to the place of enforcers. And it was sort of a pay-in to the end of the enforcer trade. My bullet point I've got: Cherry dodges, Grimson pontificates, and Domi doesn't want to know. And that's, I think, some powerful imagery that's in that film. That they do talk to Don Cherry several times, and there, of course, you got clips of Cherry throughout the film talking about Domi's fights in his career. And it just says, nope, pretty much don't want to talk about it. That's something I don't talk about on Coach's Corner, and it's a really touchy topic. Stu Grimson, who is had to retire because of head injuries, really discusses it in a brief clip, but talks about it quite a bit. And Ty Domi full on admits he's scared. And he doesn't want to know about it. He doesn't, at that point, he hasn't gone to see a doctor. He admits that and doesn't want to think about what's going to happen in the future and maybe having to deal with it. There is an admission. It was known that Probert's brain was donated to science after his untimely death. It was known that he had CTE. His wife discusses that and suggests that the doctor's assessment while he was alive was that if there's a 4-point scale of CTE, he was 2 verging on 3. So, there's discussion of those microphones and other kinds of things. The last 10 minutes of the film really does deal with his tragic end, his struggles with rehab. It's highlighted that he had success when he was with Chicago for a number of years, the second half of his career. They were giving him drug tests on an ongoing basis. It's pointed out, but not to the level that it was in the memoir, that he found ways around that in the last couple of years in Chicago, using somebody else's urine, for example, and other sorts of things. But it really deals with, the family and the tragedy of the loss of him at such a young age, and how that has influenced them, both as they're growing up. 3 of his daughters, 3 of his 4 children talk about the impact this has had in his life and how they'll miss him going forward with major life markers and other things they deal with as developmental sort of things. I think, that's entirely appropriate given the focus of this on one person. And you're left with a really sort of sad and poignant outre for the film. I think combining that with a slight discussion of CTE and other things, to me that I would interpret the film to an extent as a quiet eulogy for the hockey enforcer, for a particular way of life. It's not one that's not critical. It's not one that's nostalgic, which a lot of the memoirs and certainly the 2 Goon films are. They're very nostalgic for the enforcer and the role that they played. This film doesn't do that. It's far more focused on the tragic aspects of Probert's life, which, as I say, given that it's a personal documentary, sort of makes sense. Hockey enforcers are pretty much a disappeared breed. It's interesting to think of Probert, the way he played the game probably would more fit into this era with tough guys than it did in his own era. Every year but for his last year as a player, he had 20 plus goals. It makes me think of guys like Evander Kane, who are second, third line players, but take the tough guy role for their team. I think Probert would have fit in better in this kind of world with all the rule changes post lockout and the salary cap, meaning you can't carry guys that are just punchers. But that's all sort of slight musing and pie in the sky. I think the film's an interesting intervention in this overall discussion of hockey enforcers and the influence and the impact it's had on them in their lives. And this one, and I would say The Last Gladiators, are probably the two that going forward are going to be the most powerful in sort of telling and analyzing the story. All right, that's it for me. I'll stop myself there, which allows me to give over to my other presenters. How do I turn that off? Stop share. There we go. Okay. Up next, I'm hoping she's in the room. She wasn't there initially when I was presenting. Daniel Sailofsky.
Yes, I am here.
You're there and you got your camera turned on and everything. Awesome.
Camera turned on, ready to go.
Ready to go. I'll let you introduce yourself and your topic.
Sounds good. I hope I can share my screen. It seems like I can. Someone give me a nod or say that they can see that. Oops.
Yeah, it's up.
You're good.
Fantastic. It was up on the wrong slide, but you couldn't know that. So, all right. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Sailofsky. I am a PhD candidate at McGill University in the sociology program. I'm a former graduate of the master's program at Brock University in sport management. I look at kind of a sport sociology, violence, and deviance angle in sport, or I look at sport through the angles of violence and deviance, do a little bit of work on social media as well. That's a bit of my academic background. I'm also, I was until the pandemic, I guess, also a collegiate basketball coach. I've coached both women's and men's basketball. So that's a bit of my sport background as well. Also, of course, played hockey at a very, very low level until I was about like 18, 19, and then switched to the beer league kind of part of the game. So involved in hockey in that way. I've been a fan all my life, and recently started doing a little bit of work on it in the last few years. And today I'm really excited. It's my first hockey conference, and I'm really excited to present this paper, Masculinity, Cancel Culture, and Woke Capitalism, Exploring Social Media Response to Brendan Leipzig's Leaked Conversation. So I've done this, I presented this at a different conference as well that was not based out of mostly Canada and not a specific hockey conference. So I had to do a bit more explaining the Brendan Leipzig story, but I feel like that might be a bit more known in this case. But in case it's not, before I get any further, I do want to offer a disclaimer and a trigger warning for very misogynistic, sexist, racist language, which is present throughout the leaked messages that I'll be talking about, and which are the subject of the Twitter conversation, the Instagram conversation that was leaked on Twitter that I'll be discussing really in the next slide. So just, I want people to be aware for that basically right now is when it's coming. So what is this scandal? What is this leak conversation that I'm talking about? Well, on May 6th, 2020, a Twitter user named Cairo posted screenshots of a leaked group conversation involving a leaked Instagram group conversation involving then NHL player Brendan Leipzig of the Washington Capitals, Manitoba Bison's university hockey player and his brother, Jeremy Leipzig, and several others, which showed a variety of vulgar, misogynistic, sexist, and racist comments that you can see here, either Leipzig saying the things himself or liking, and giving that kind of affirmation of other pretty heinous comments. So these are just a small sample of it. There's about I think there's 8 screenshots or 8 at least screen grabs that I then made of about this length that showed these different comments. This just kind of gives you a taste of the horrific things that were said. So when this was posted, this immediately resulted in basically a flurry of Twitter activity from people who are fans of the game, people involved in the game in the media space, some other players and some former players as well, but really a real focus from fans and the hockey media. I also want to stress that this was in May 2020, which if I think everyone remembers, was also kind of one of the more peak pandemic times. It was during the pandemic that we're still in the midst of. It was also when all professional sports and all organized sports in general in North America were completely shut down, which probably increased the coverage of the event. This was like the big news in hockey at that time because there was no other real hockey going on, especially at the professional level. So what was the media response? These are just 4 of the 7 tweets that I chose to look at more for my analysis. But basically members of the hockey media in Canada and the US were giving their opinions on the scandal and the response to the scandal by the Capitals and the University of Manitoba hockey team. For my analysis of the kind of broader conversation about this, I decided to pick 7 of the highest traffic tweets, so ones that had at least 50 replies to them, but also that were neutral in a sense. And when I mean neutral, I mean that they were reporting the news about the incident rather than actually really giving a strong opinion about what they were. So it wasn't that someone was saying, what a horrible thing that Brendan Leipzig said. I can't believe that the Capitals haven't released him yet. It wasn't that kind of, I didn't want to take those kinds of tweets which already had a judgment about the situation or about the response, but really just tweets that gave the news. So here you see from Samantha Pell, the Washington Capitals are aware and looking into the recent Instagram comments attributed to Brendan Leipzig, or Tariq El-Bashir, the Caps will terminate the contract of Brendan Leipzig today. Nothing more than just reporting the news of what happened. In the interest of time, I've only included these 4, but I gathered, like I said, 7 that came up in between May 6th and May 8th that talked about either the initial release of the tweets or the kind of conversation around it, or the actual result of this scandal, which was in the short term, was the Capitals actually releasing Brendan Leipzig and putting him on waivers. I then gathered the replies to these 7 tweets, which initially yielded 1,310 replies. After cleaning the data, removing replies that either were like responses to other people and weren't actually commenting on the initial 7 tweets themselves, or ones that like wrote RT as in retweet and just like didn't really comment after that, or those that had like a very undiscernible kind of message regarding, with either like just a GIF or an emoji of some sort that was just impossible to really discern what it was. I filtered those down to about 900 to 969 replies. And basically they kind of fell mostly in 2 different broad meanings, which was basically either disapproval of Leipzig's conduct and then support for Brendan Leipzig's release from the team, or approval or excusing of Leipzig's conduct, and then usually coupled with that, or sometimes coupled with that, being upset about his eventual release from the team. And when I first looked through the discourse around the internet, not just on Twitter, and was kind of living through this for the first time, I noticed this initial divide in terms of approval and disapproval, and also thought that they could perhaps, these 2 angles could perhaps better be understood using 2 kind of theoretical constructs that have been studied with regards to hockey, definitely, and the other more a social process that's going on right now. And these are basically ideas of Canadian hockey masculinity versus other forms of masculinity, and how that is how that's approved of or not, and notions of cancel culture, and whether cancel culture is something that is acceptable, or is something that is really happening, or something that is a positive thing right now. And basically I noticed a divide between how people were falling on those 2 ideas, either masculinity, the 2 different forms of masculinity, or how they felt about cancel culture. And I noticed that was, I think, having an impact perhaps on the responses, and really shaped some of those responses. So like I said, the first theoretical lens and kind of divide, which I'm trying to understand this through, is really hegemonic masculinity, or Canadian hockey masculinity more specifically, and inclusive masculinity. So just a little primer, I'm sure many are familiar with a lot of this, but hegemonic masculinity was initially conceptualized by Raewyn Connell in the 1990s, and has been written about a lot in sports circles and a lot in hockey circles as well. And in short, it's the culturally exalted is the words that she uses, and the best or most accepted way of being a man at a particular point in time amongst a particular group of men, or in a particular social context. It's considered the configuration of gender practices which guarantees the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. And the performance and maintenance of hegemonic masculinity has historically been done through, among other ways, through the participation and the success in often violent, often homosocial, so only men, male sports, where men can demonstrate both their physical prowess and their physical dominance, as well as demonstrating their kind of societal dominance and their place at the top of the gender and just general hierarchy between both men and women, and between both themselves as men and other men who aren't practicing those violent kind of sport practices. Canadian hockey masculinity, which is defined by Kirstie Allin in 2015 as a sense of masculine style linked to hitting, fighting, and physical confrontation, I would say it's almost like a close cousin, or maybe just a hockey-specific version of some of the typical sport-based hegemonic masculinity that we see. It obviously has certain qualities that are, if not unique to Canada, then very specific, I guess, to Canada. Canadian hockey masculinity typically valorizes military-like self-sacrifice. Think that not horrific, but think the really bad video that the NHL posted before the playoffs last year, where it was just a compilation of players getting hurt by blocking shots. Think things like that. Also valorizes, physical toughness, violence, dominance, and it's historically been marked in playing circles, and hopefully this is changing, but it still exists, and it's historically marked by misogynistic behavior in locker rooms or on the ice, negative kind of homophobic or misogynistic language, and jokes about homophobia or misogynistic type jokes as well. In contrast to kind of this Canadian hockey masculinity, or this hegemonic hockey masculinity, Anderson and McCormack have a different kind of view of the nature of athlete masculinity. They argue that, and they found in their research of usually male adolescents, college students, young male college athletes, that this more inclusive masculinity, is the words they use, is in the process, and in many cases actually already has replaced kind of the orthodox masculinity. Again, that's the words they use, of old. And this orthodox masculinity is really the hegemonic masculinity, or is close enough to the hegemonic masculinity that I've been talking about before. So they argue that this is becoming this inclusive, softer, kinder, more gender inclusive and more sexuality inclusive behavior is replacing the older forms of masculinity. And they argue that athletes are no longer kind of shackled by this older, brutish, homophobic, misogynistic form of masculinity. They don't need to practice that in order to be men and in order to be athletes. Again, there is quite a lot of debate of whether they're right in this assertion, or whether they're a little bit more optimistic than what we're seeing in reality. But this is the way that they've conceptualized this, hopefully, I would argue, a new form of masculinity that is coming to the fore. The other theoretical lens that I'm looking at with regards to these responses is cancel culture and the differing views people have about it. Being a relatively new term in kind of the cultural zeitgeist, there's very little academic work on cancel culture. There's quite a bit of work in journalistic spaces, as I think many would know. But cancel culture is basically a form of boycott or strike where consumers or workers withdraw or withhold support from or their labor as a response to some organization, some person, some powerful entity's abuse of power, or their kind of morally questionable behavior, racism, sexism, homophobia, or they try to shame them for that behavior. Proponents of cancel culture argue that the act of canceling a person or an organization is not actually anything new, and that those with economic, social, political power have always engaged in canceling other people for their views, or not even giving them a chance to enter the building or to participate in a certain process in the first place. And the only difference now, and the only reason cancel culture is brought up now, is because the power to actually do that canceling has changed. With the advent of things like social media, for example, regular people have the power to cancel other larger, more powerful socially and politically entities if they find that their behavior is objectionable. Detractors of cancel culture, on the other hand, of course, object to this phenomenon basically on the grounds that it stifles free speech, open debate, any kind of contrary views. It promotes, working in a silo and only repeating the views that are commonly held, or only using the views that are socially acceptable at a time. It promotes self-censorship, groupthink, and those are basically the two sides of it. Woke capitalism is something that people also believe has been another result of kind of cancel culture. And it's the idea that, quote, brands will gravitate toward low cost, high noise signals as a substitute for genuine reform to ensure their survival. So think of an organization like, I'll give an example, like the NFL, the National Football League, who might post end racism during the George Floyd protests and kind of the racial reckoning that was happening last year, but do nothing about their very unequal hiring practices of mostly white coaches, or do very little about some of the racism in the sport. Instead, only giving this kind of high signal statement that they release without actually engaging in any general reforms. This is the idea of also maybe companies removing an offending person from their job if they are found to, have posted something racist on Facebook 10 years ago, but not actually doing anything about future employees, not actually doing anything about discrimination maybe in their own company, but using this kind of firing to say that, hey, look, we did something, we care. This is how we can show that we care about this issue as well. I'm running a little low on time. There's always so much to talk about here, but with these theoretical lenses in mind, I analyzed 969 responses, came up with 31 different codes under 6 broad themes. These are agree with Leipzig, agree with the Leipzig punishment, disagree with the Leipzig punishment, commentary on hockey generally, comparison with other situations, meta commentary, and unclear tweets. I want to stress though, most tweets were supportive of the punishment, but many expressed the opposite view. So we're talking like 60% were supportive of Leipzig's punishment and therefore unsupportive of the behavior, but about probably 25 to 30% were still actually expressing the opposite view. They were unsupportive. They were negative actually about the punishment and said it was too harsh, and were sometimes supportive of the behavior that was exhibited by Leipzig, and those in the conversation. Can't go through all the codes, of course, but I'd like to give kind of an idea of the data we're working with. So for good punishment, good result, these are short tweets generally like well done or good or W or good to hear after hearing about the punishment for Leipzig and him being released from the team. Consequences for actions were things like some lessons are more expensive than others and freedom of speech isn't freedom from consequences. Quality of player were tweets like there was no way they were going to risk blowing up their dressing room and dealing with distractions for a mediocre player. If he was a star, he'd still be there. And let's see what happens to a superstar. How will the team or league react then? For some of the disapproval codes, they are much more often combined with multiple kind of codes and reasons together. So these were things like privacy concerns. So things like meh, I don't care what was said in a private conversation between friends, even if it was made public, and private chat and it cost him his job, sad. Things like caving to cancel culture or politically correct or social justice warrior culture. These are things like witch hunt, American classic, or oh Christ, our cancel culture in action, and destroy a man's career over a private conversation. That's the hockey SJW, social justice warrior way. Or things like mob mentality in this country is so out of control at this point, it's scary. For disproportionate punishment, we saw things like this response is disproportionately severe by comparison to the offense. They put offense in quotation marks. I would definitely just say offense by itself. Just words and freedom was another common code. This was things like, haha, for words, what a soft world, or wow, so freedom of speech and privacy is no longer allowed. They may have said some cringeworthy words, but it was between them. And lastly, there were some people that said bad behavior, but basically is the code that I use. And this was people who said like, yeah, he messed up pretty badly, but at what point is privacy considered? Or it wasn't nice, but it was never meant to be public. It's scary how many people don't know anyone involved feel justified in judging him when they have said much worse. This last tweet, for example, was privacy concern. It was the everyone says bad things code, and it was the bad behavior but code. Promise I'm almost done here. So what does all this mean? What do these responses have to do with masculinity and cancel culture? Well, first, I found that whether someone approved or disapproved of Leipzig's behavior and punishment basically came down to where they fell on cancel culture and the acceptability of traditional Canadian hockey masculinity. Many responded that the comments observed in this conversation reflected just kind of the normal way that Canadian hockey players and hockey players in general speak. And in doing so, really reified some of the norms of historically hegemonic Canadian hockey masculinity. Excusing behavior that includes referring to a woman as a, quote, fat native pig, another a slut, and again, a third a whore cunt is not only just heinous and frankly kind of disgusting, but from a more macro perspective, it's also reliant on the continued acceptance of a Canadian hockey masculinity that condones misogyny and is built on these colonialist, sexist, and very racist foundations, and doesn't see a problem with behavior that reifies again those norms. Negative responses to the Leipzig punishment were either based on the idea again that this misogynistic behavior was okay and common, or that the Leipzig brothers were being treated unfairly, actually, and they were the ones who were actually being hurt by this. I used the himpathy kind of code here. They were being treated unfairly by like a judgmental mob that was out to get them, or a combination of both of these. So both saying that the negative comments weren't actually, both saying that this wasn't actually so bad and saying that they were being treated unfairly. The second and last key discussion point I'll talk about here is regarding woke capitalism. So quality of player, NHL at large doesn't care, and some of the comparison codes all brought up the ideas of woke capitalism. So these are tweets like, would everyone be so quick to cancel if this was Ovechkin or Crosby, and he isn't good enough to be an asshole and get away with it? That might be true to an extent, in the sense that Leipzig was not a highly valued player, which made a situation a good possible example for woke capitalism to actually take place. Again, this was pandemic time, height of the pandemic, no sports going on, so a lot of attention placed on this by sports media. And the Capitals could release him without making any other substantial changes to their culture or to the way they actually go about doing business. And he wasn't a super valuable player. He's, a 5 or 6 goals a year type of player, bounced around from the minors to the NHL. Again, here, the people who are bringing up woke capitalism, this was again a critique of cancel culture in a way, but not from the perspective of the player or even from like the judgmental mob, but rather from an organizational perspective, which I think is pretty interesting. They focus, the critiques here focus on the organization's handling of the issue, the lack of consistency dealing with other issues. A lot of people brought up that like Evgeny Kuznetsov, a much better player, didn't have any consequences for being caught with cocaine. I would argue that this Leipzig thing is much worse than consuming drugs in their own time. But regardless, people made that comparison. And people were upset with the lack of consistency with issues like this. They were upset with the inefficacy of this approach for dealing with larger structural problems like racism and misogyny in hockey generally, and the lack of this kind of result actually doing anything to curb those behaviors. And while we can't, of course, speak for how players' views on misogynistic behavior or cancel culture have changed, like there's no way I can speak to how players actually viewed the situation given this data. I don't have I didn't interview players. I didn't speak to players. There's no survey data about players and how they viewed the situation. I think one of the implications here is actually that we can see is actually that hockey fans and those in the public still actually differ in terms of how they view this type of athlete behavior and how they view team responses to it. I think it's also interesting to see how views are not only informed by what we think of as acceptable masculinity or behavior, but also on people's views of something like cancel culture and its merits and kind of the intersections that we see between views on acceptable masculinity and then how people view cancel culture. Almost got that under 20 minutes. I really got close, but thank you so much for listening, everyone. And I'm not sure if we have a question period for this, but if anyone has any questions, I see some things in the chat, but
yeah.
I would love
We'll do the questions after the 3 papers.
Okay. Sorry, I did not realize we were 15 minutes. I'm very sorry about that.
Anyway, so our next presenter, it's actually okay. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, and we're heading into a break after us for a little bit, so I'm not too packed about it. Leslie?
Hi, thank you, Fred, and thanks, Daniel. That was really, both of those presentations were really interesting to me. I am humbled to be here with such distinguished academics. I'm not exactly an academic myself. I'm a fiction writer. I'm here on the strength of, strength of a novel that I've written about hockey called Seeking the Center. What academic background I have and career background is in folklore, not in sport, but folklore looks at expressive forms, which could be sport. My specialty happens to be music, actually, but folklore looks at expressive forms and asks how practitioners of those forms fashion them to create, to maintain, to sustain, and to adapt their identity in the face of whatever might occur in their lives or in the lives of their communities. I guess you could say. Seeking the Center, my novel, is about the main character is a female hockey player, but she looks at the sport often through the eyes of her male friends who play the sport, and so again, I sort of looked at hockey from a folkloristic point of view. My presentation is called Don't Let Them Hijack Your Hockey, Seeking a New Game. Why can't they treat me like just a normal goalie, asks Agnes, the protagonist in my novel, Seeking the Center. It's because to them, the guys, she isn't normal. She's a Métis woman making herself very visible in a pickup game by her effectiveness at stopping their shots. In response, they've taken their frustration out on her through violence. She's ready to quit. They don't care about the game, she tells her friend Tess. They just want to score on me, and if they can't, they turn into psychopaths. Don't let them hijack your hockey, Tess tells her. But Agnes's hockey, a game that she can throw herself into with abandon, one that affords her respect and aligns with her personal values and her cherished traditions, exists only as an ideal. And in the eyes of the guys who try to chase her from the game, she is hijacking their hockey. Ice hockey has existed in northern places for a very long time. Even today, there are many different hockeys. But to most people, including the guys, including Agnes herself, the game that represents hockey's evolutionary apex is men's professional hockey. This game is relatively young and in North America anyway, has some of its roots in a kind of bargain struck around 100, 125 years ago between working class men and their employers, their social superiors. These small-scale businessmen and industrialists began organizing hockey teams and competitions to channel the destructive antisocial tendencies that their off-hours workers exhibited in bars, casinos, and brothels, and also to distract them from the infinitely greater evil of unionism. The resulting hockey bore the indelible stamp of the hard-working, hard-living Canadian men who faced the hardships of the frontier with pride in their ability to endure punishment. It allowed players to translate the physical hardships and social and economic frustrations that they faced every day into an expressive on-ice form. It was an escape from life in a copper mine, a logging camp, or a paper mill. A few broken bones or missing teeth were a small price to pay for hockey glory. Hockey became a source of income and prestige for these workers and their bosses alike. It allowed the social elites, who never themselves engaged in physical violence, to experience its thrill vicariously and to enhance their own feeling of masculinity, a gladiatorial flavor that remains today. Players could bolster their own manhood and that of their bosses by beating the guys in the next town or factory. On the other hand, if they lost, their masculinity could be in question. So you see, this hockey was not purely recreational. Something more was at stake. In short order, rules against hiring ringers were circumvented or trampled, this violence justified by the need to win, and often through the money to be made through gambling and eventually ticket sales. Now, hockey was not organized as a way for women to vent antisocial or destructive tendencies. Women had no non-working hours during which they could debauch or unionize. They were already sufficiently oppressed to meet society's requirements, minding the home and children, so that men could demonstrate their masculinity on or off the ice without feminine or domestic distraction. For women who have nevertheless chosen to play, their participation has been feared as an act of resistance and a critique of the social system, along with the notions of masculinity and femininity that support it. Women have been about as welcome on the ice as Agnes, faced with a breathtaking array of obstacles based in a made-up notion of femininity, which asserts that aggressive and competitive patterns of behavior learned through play are appropriate for males and inappropriate for females. Without evidence, women and girls are claimed to be physically, intellectually, and emotionally inferior and unable to provide any real competition. And the lie that strenuous activity damages female reproductive organs has been called on time and time again to exclude them from sport. To this day, girls and women are pushed out of team sports and into expressive, aesthetically pleasing sports, or offered sex-segregated sports like ringette, a gentler sport with a suitably feminine image. To mitigate the threat of players who resist this made-up concept of femininity, the media habitually emphasizes their heterosexuality or their womanliness by commenting on their appearance as opposed to their play. Women who aren't heterosexual might be simply ignored. Lack of appropriately sized gear hinders hockey's accessibility to women, but the lack of media coverage is more harmful. In 2013, it was reported that while 40% of athletes are women, they receive 4% of media coverage. That's in overall sports, not just hockey. When the Be Bold for Change movement happened in 2017, most people where I live didn't even know that the United States has a women's national hockey team. Meanwhile, men's pro hockey maintains a defensive stance against incursions of the feminine to buttress its masculine image. Concerns seen as female or domestic are, like women's sport itself, often treated as distractions to be minimized. Escape from the feminine and domestic, what one head coach called honey-do lists, will make you a better player. And if just seeing a woman in the stands can throw off your game as it did for a certain rookie, imagine the distraction caused by charges of actual crimes against women. When winning becomes so important that it justifies any erasure, any violence, that's when it turns upon its own. The men's pro hockey notion of masculinity is just as made up and just as oppressive as its version of femininity. The habitual use of misogynist and homophobic language in the sport, the purpose of which is to stabilize players' masculine power, amounts to a violent expression of oppression and harm within the dressing room itself, what has been called violent acts injurious at a political or ideological level. Hazing rituals that cruelly or even sadistically enforce a toxically masculine hierarchical structure, and profane and hard-driving win-at-all-costs coaching techniques may conflict with players' cultures or sensibilities, and all too often cross over into abuse. Racist mascots, language, and stereotypes, again often used to stabilize power over an other, also constitute violence. Pro hockey's culture of conformity, in which it is unacceptable to draw attention to oneself at the expense of the team and its drive to win, and its unaddressed mental health and substance abuse issues can cause emotional distress and even lead to death. Yes, assumptions that broken bones are a small price to pay, or that playing through injury or mental illness is a positive representation of true masculinity, are questionable. The good news is that while we tend to see men's pro hockey as a natural and permanent fixture, an essentially completed phenomenon, it's also true that other hockeys and other sport cultures do exist or can be imagined. In the context of First Nations hockey, for example, players can consciously accept or reject qualities of the sport to make it their own. Different values are seeping up from junior leagues, which, for example, are reconsidering fighting, and from podcasts, blogs, fan groups that interrogate racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and working conditions within the sport, to name a few. There are also values within the current sport itself that could be embraced more fully, or removed from the realm of cliché and taken to heart. We're a team in the locker room and a family. It doesn't matter what different beliefs guys have or where they come from. That's the way it is on the hockey team, said one NHL player. This is beginning to happen, but the pace is slow. Although some NHL players are speaking out for LGBTQ equality and for racial justice, much more needs to be done at the team and league levels. Retired players, at least, are speaking out about CTE. At least one player has publicly asserted that a hypothetical gay player would be accepted by his team. Others have publicly supported out folks within the league's orbit. Female players happen to be ahead in this regard. Out, married to rival players, even playing while pregnant. Talk about proving that the feminine or domestic doesn't have to hinder athletic performance. During the Be Bold for Change movement, over 50 players took a stand for women's equal opportunity on the ice, rejecting USA Hockey's enticements for them to effectively cross the picket line. Finally, there's already a pro league which is rewriting the script, potentially for all professional sport. It's the WNBA, where players, coaches, staff, and executives feel more comfortable being open about their sexual orientation, race, value systems, passions for social justice, challenges balancing work and life, demands for gender equality, and every other facet of their lived experience. Guys, it's time to realize that maybe the feminine wasn't the enemy. Maybe the forces trying to hijack your sport were, and are, something else entirely. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that leaves us a couple of minutes if we were playing by to the 1 o'clock. But like I said, we're heading into a break, so I'll let it go a little bit longer if people want to ask questions. So we'll open the floor to that. Of any of the presenters, please.
I don't have a question so much. I just want to say, Leslie, your reading voice is lovely. You need to
Oh,
read
gosh.
for a few hours, okay?
That is extremely kind of you. I'm very self-conscious about hearing myself speak, so thank you.
Yes, I would say if I sit there, I would want to go to your book lunch when your novel comes out.
Well, I am on the authors panel later in this conference,
Excellent.
so where
Okay.
I'll talk a little bit. I'll do a short reading and talk a little bit more about, sort of what the novel is actually about.
Forward to that. I was going to ask you a question about your character, but I'll let it go till after that. I see a couple of people have turned on their cameras. Keelan McDonald was the one I saw first and turned on his camera first. So Keelan, go ahead.
I think Rachel had a question before me if she wants to go first.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Those are all really interesting. I agree, Leslie has a great reading voice, but I'm actually surprised I didn't know this. Can you explain the Be Bold for Change movement? Because I don't think I've heard of this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. So in 2017, the women on the United States national hockey team basically went on strike right before the World Championships.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Right, because they have been subject to, just a incredibly much less financial support than the men's national team. And they habitually have to practice at what's basically like a kids' summer camp type place, whereas the men are in a big fancy Olympic complex in Colorado. So they basically, and all kinds of things from the training support that's available to them and travel stipends, anything you can possibly imagine. They just for years, and they've been complaining about this for years, and so they finally just basically went on strike, and as a result, USA Hockey sort of went down the ranks of women hockey players. Do you remember this?
And they all said no. Yeah.
Yeah, like they went down. They finally were asking, like, I think they were asking, like, 16-year-old players who are still in high school, and even those girls were saying, nope, we're not.
The players contacted them.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what that movement was?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I was referring to. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry about that, to not be more clear.
And Fred, I love your shirt. It's a great movie.
Thanks.
Great movie.
I have a bit of a gimmick where I have T-shirts for just about every topic I talk about in my sociology of sport class. So
Oh, okay,
figured I could roll out one of those.
cool. Thank you.
Keelan?
Yeah, thank you. Merci to all the presenters. All three of you were really interesting. I took copious notes during all three presentations. My question's for Daniel, actually. I was wondering if you could take a minute to talk about putting aside whether or not people or we think that the punishment was adequate or appropriate for what Leipzig did. Do you think that the punishment is going to change anything about this hegemonic masculinity or Canadian hockey masculinity? Is it going to lead players to think twice before they say something or text something or write something on social media? Or do you think it was more of a publicity stunt that people are going to be quick to forget?
That's a fantastic question. And as I think everyone already saw, I have the tendency to be long-winded. So that's a great question. There's multiple parts to that question and many parts I would love to get into. The short of it, I would say, is that I don't think the punishment itself will result in a change to hockey culture. I think that the fact that they punished because of some of the response by people more generally has a better chance of affecting hockey culture. So it's sort of indirectly, I do think that we are seeing somewhat of a shift, especially among younger people, about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. At the same time, I do think that while seeing this punishment that Leipzig suffered, punishment in quotations here, might have an impact on some people's public displays of these kinds of conversations. So like putting things down in writing or writing things in an email, putting it in a Twitter conversation could change that. I can't see how this will be a culture change more generally, especially for things like informal locker room conversations or one-on-one conversations, or the way that, after a game, the team goes out to the bar and is talking about the women that they are approaching. I don't think it's going to change that, unfortunately. Maybe I'm just being cynical in that way, but I do think that the fact that this punishment happened is indicative of a change that we might be seeing in the way that people approach these behaviors, which I think would obviously be a positive thing. I had one other point that I wanted to make, because you brought up several really good questions there, but I can't think of it right now. But the short of it is no, not really, but yes, possibly because of wider cultural changes. But again, it has to be stressed, but that's the other point. It has to be stressed that there's a lot of people who still responded the opposite way in terms of actually supporting the behavior, saying it was normal or saying the punishment was severe. And that's even accounting for the fact that this is Twitter, where it's a bit more of often I would argue in some cases, a more left-leaning progressive space. In certain cases, it's not a like Parler, it's not Telegram, it's not even Facebook to an extent in terms of the right-wing, left-wing political divides. So this is even accounting for the fact that social desirability wise, there's probably some people who censored themselves, who actually did think it was a crazy punishment or too big of a punishment, or thought the behavior was okay and didn't actually speak. And even considering the fact that there was all those people who probably self-censored, there's still quite a few people who are like, this isn't so bad. This is how everyone talks. This is how me and my friends talk, which I don't know why you'd want to publicize that, but that's another point. And then also people saying like this punishment was severe. So I think we do have to keep in mind that sometimes we can be in our own echo chambers where we all agree that, this is horrible behavior and this shouldn't exist. And there's a whole bunch of people out there who don't agree with us and think that hockey culture is fine the way it is great the way it is. So yeah, that's a whole lot of words that I said as usual, but I hope that deals with some of the questions. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Merci. Thank you.
Okay. In the hands going up, I saw Sally was the next one to raise your hands. Go ahead.
Hi. Sorry about that. Hello. Hi, my question is for Daniel. If this gentleman's conversation was supposedly private, then how did it get out there for everyone to see? And I'm in the United States and we have free speech here, but and it was kind of reprehensible, but if it was supposed to be private, how did it get out? Maybe I missed that.
You didn't miss it. It's more that there's no real clear answer, I don't think, on how it got out. I mean, the truth is that any kind of conversation and any kind of text format on phones or online can be screenshotted, where you take a picture of your screen and then it's public viewing. The like 8 members or so of the conversation, maybe 6 members of the conversation, I don't think it was any of them who leaked it, but somehow, some way, somebody took pictures of the conversation, and it eventually ended up with some Twitter user who would then post it online. Here in Canada, we have free speech as well. It's constrained by a few different of our charter. It's a charter right, but it is it can be. I always forget the word they use in Article 1 of the Canadian Charter, but it can be constrained, or it can be not taken away, but it has limits to it. There is limits to free speech based on a variety of factors. But the point here also, I think, that we have to stress is that there was no legal consequence actually for Brendan Leipzig. He wasn't accused of any kind of defamation or libel, or he wasn't accused of any kind of violence in terms of like criminal court or criminal law. He was just released from his employment, which, I mean, that is obviously a consequence, but it's not a legal consequence. So yeah, I don't know exactly how it got out, but it did get out. And as some people did say in their comments, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go with 2 more questions. Stacy, and then we have Betty Ann Dawson screen name that's there. Stacy, you're up.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Fred, my question is for you. I am wondering, first of all, about the Sonny Crockett jacket, but secondly, I'm wondering if you could comment briefly on kind of where you see that sort of the larger question about the role or need for enforcers is today in terms of the conversation. Obviously, a lot of things have changed, as you said, but this does still come up. Like when the Tom Wilson debate was going on a few weeks ago, it certainly gave supporters of the code and the role of enforcers a platform to say, like, this would never have happened if I was out there on the ice. But do you think that maybe outside the Department of Player Safety, sort of the hold of that idea is kind of in decline, or is it just in the background sort of thing in terms of hockey's whenever these events happen, it's because we actually need to have more enforcers again, or players need to have an opportunity to punish, etc. Exactly.
Yeah.
Where that
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that always gets at the question of what are the discourses of the culture and the things that players and even executives will say versus where's the commercial and the economic and all that lying. I found Tom Wilson fascinating because, Paros is a former enforcer, I'm sure you well know. And my reaction to that was that he was kind of given a pass because of maybe some of him being somewhere between a bit of an enforcer and a rat. But then at the same time, there's those arguments. Same thing came up with the recent hit on Evans as well. That I've heard some discourse out there that players are saying if there was someone to come get him after, he wouldn't have done that hit. Those arguments are always out there. Whether or not there's ever been validity to them, I think is a question. Certainly, almost everybody within hockey believed that there was validity to them for literally decades. I think what we've seen practically is that rule changes have cut down on things quite a bit and more enforcement. I mean, it raises the question of, what fines and player safety and all those guys do is I think at this point far more impactful than anything that maybe occurs on the ice. I could be entirely wrong about that. I mean, that's really just me sort of having sat there and thought about that stuff. I will say that you will probably see ongoing calls for more. Realistically, practically, you've seen enforcers go out of the game because of salary caps and because of rule changes. No team is going to carry a guy who does nothing but come out once or twice a game to intimidate people. You've got, that's what I was trying to say with, I think Probert would have done okay in this era of actually having to play hockey at the same time as being a big tough guy. I think that's where there's still an amount to that, but of course nowhere near anything else out there.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay, our other question over there. Hello.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes. Hello, Fred. And hello, everyone. This is Bob Dawson, not Betty Ann Dawson. Just to clarify things, I have a question for Daniel. And I must say, I enjoyed your presentation very much. And I'm hoping that you will make it available to those who are taking part in this particular session. I have a question or two that might be slightly off of the main theme here, but I think it's irrelevant. I think it's relevant in the context of your broader presentation, and that is, do you think that politics, given what's happened in the past year with the George Floyd and subsequent events that have had an impact on society, do you think politics has no place in sport, including hockey?
That's a great question. I would think exactly the opposite, actually, from a personal perspective. And I think that I think it's always had a place in society. It's always had a place in hockey and sport. Politics have always had a place in hockey and sport. The idea that they didn't in the past, I think, is both. It's mistaken, and it's also an untruthful view of how we see politics, where we assume that status quo, or where we assume that the way something is done and seem and presented as being natural isn't a political process as well. So the fact that hockey was, has always been a very white sport, that's not just by accident. That's not apolitical in and of itself. So I would argue, first of all, that sports have always been political. It's just that sometimes the political nature of it has been kind of shielded from view. And I would really say, from a personal perspective, and I think that we're getting towards that sports, because of what they are and what they mean to so many people, and the fact that they're such an important labor arena, in a sense, and pardon the pun there with arena, but a labor space where we have these extremely visible workers, and kind of the most visible workers we have, because whether we think of them that way or not, hockey players, baseball players, basketball players, men's and women's both they are technically labor. They're not the ownership class. They're not the capitalist class in this kind of arena. So I do think that because of sports' importance and what they are often, and how they often reflect the politics of a particular society, and because of how important they are as a space for understandings of labor relations to play out, not only are they political, but they will continue to be and should be. And I think that we're seeing a lot of the empowerment of a lot of players realizing their value as workers, with things like, not in the hockey space necessarily, but things like, for example, last playoffs when the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team striked and boycotted a game and said, we're not playing tonight, and literally shut down the game. And there's been labor actions like that in the past. I'm very familiar with basketball, so it is one of those things that I know a bit better. But for example, in the 70s, I believe, players in the marquee all-star game that was about to be played, players from both teams got together and basically told the ownership, like, we're not coming out. We will boycott this game unless you make certain concessions to us in terms of, I believe it was salary expectations, just certain things involved in their collective bargaining agreement that were not fair at the time. And that was, again, used as a labor kind of strike to advocate for better conditions for them as working people. So I do think sports has always been a political space. And I think more and more players are realizing the power that they have, again, somewhat due, I think, to social media, and hopefully as well to changing norms regarding and changing norms regarding how us as fans even see athletes and understand their place and their position. So again, another really long answer, but those are my views, at least, on it. Yeah. And thanks again. Great question.
Yeah, if I may, just a quick follow-up question. Why do you think that of all the sports leagues, hockey was late coming to the show in terms of speaking out about racial injustice and social justice.
I have two principal thoughts on that. One is just the traditionalist nature of hockey. It's still a league largely run by an old boys club in terms of even things like player evaluation, and especially in terms of the way that we view racial issues, the way that we view even labor issues. And I would also say that it's a bit of a reflection of Canadian culture as well. I think we have a tendency in Canada to paper over issues that we have. We often use the United States at our southern border to basically say that we're not, we don't really have these problems like the US does. They might have a racism problem, but we don't have that racism problem. And I think some of that you see with hockey culture as well. Hockey culture really is, I think, a reflection of Canadian culture to an extent, especially like North American NHL kind of culture. And because of that, we don't want to admit that we have some of the same race issues. We have some of the same anti-Indigenous and even worse anti-Indigenous issues. And because of that desire to, portray Canada in a certain light and to, keep that, I would argue, myth going of like Canada as like this beacon of light where we're just polite and we want to just, have a good time with our friends and we're just nice and polite and we don't cause any problems. I think wanting to keep that mythology alive just as much as we want to keep the Canadian hockey masculinity mythology alive is part of why the sport is so late, has been so late historically, and in the last few years especially, to react to broader social change. It's just it's an institution that's resistant to change in general at the best of times, but especially when it feels like it's being unfairly criticized for issues that, those are issues for somewhere else. That's not us. So that's my view on that.
Thanks very much for your comments.
Thank you. I appreciate it.